Next up, we've got a slight amendment to our agenda. We're going to talk to Convergence as an organisation, and that's Keith Merchant, who's going to come on stage very shortly and talk about the blended finance platform. So we're looking forward to hearing from Keith. And then most importantly, just to keep our eyes on the time, no criticism of you, Pete. There's just a lot for us to get through. So without any further delay, we'll welcome Keith to the stage.
Great, thank you very much indeed, and good evening to all of you from here in Toronto in Canada, and I guess good afternoon to all of you in Brisbane. Can all of you hear me and see me clearly and correctly? Great. So let me start off by, talking to you a little bit about what is blended finance. But before that, I want to talk to you about what Convergence is and who we are and what we do. So may I get the next slide, please? Great. So Convergence is really an organization set up to advance the concept of blended finance. We are the global network of blended finance, where we generate blended finance data, intelligence, and deal flow to increase private investment in developing countries. Now, we do this in two different ways. One is in terms of getting transactions off the ground, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that later on. But we also try to build a community of practice around blended finance. My friend Peter earlier was talking about transparency or building a common lexicon. That's a lot of what we attempt and aim to do and we've been set up to do. Next slide, please. Now, we are a membership-based organization supported by the Government of Canada, the Australian government in the form of DFAT, and various other governments around the world. Also, of course, impact investors, foundations, and private investors and everybody in between. So we work with a large range of organizations, but our biggest supporters in terms of funding are the Government of Canada and the Government of Australia. Next slide, please. So what is blended finance? Going back to first principles, blended finance is essentially the idea of using development funding. So this could be from a public agency, such as DFAT, or from a philanthropic agency, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, who put in money into a structure or even outside a structure on concessional terms or below market terms or asymmetrical terms, with the expressed intent or focus of mobilizing private capital that is sitting on the sidelines to invest in projects or blended finance structures on market terms. So we're not here to subsidize the private sector, we're here to mobilize the private sector. So the whole idea is to get private capital that's sitting on the sidelines that would be additional to the financing that the government is bringing to the table. So that is, in a nutshell, the idea of blended finance. Let me repeat that one more time. It's the idea of using development funding on concessional terms to mobilize private capital on market terms into blended finance structures that are SDG aligned in developing countries. Next slide, please. Now, we at Convergence have a database of historical blended finance transactions. We collect that through publicly available information sources. We have agreements with organizations such as the OECD where we share information. And we also work very closely with our members to collect some of this data and intelligence. I have taken a subset of the information that we have, and I've pulled out the trends that we're seeing in the WASH sector, which I think is germane to this particular conversation. And what we notice is up until the end of 2018, we've tracked around 36 transactions that we have in our database that have been blended and that have reached financial close. And what I mean by financial close is that have actually raised a certain amount of financing and have actually gotten projects off the ground. Now, these 36 transactions have around a multitude of different investors, 180 investors. These could be investors such as the Stone Family Foundation, the Osprey Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, all foundations that are very active in the WASH space, but also it could include various investors such as the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund or Metito, who are also private investors who are very interested in WASH infrastructure, so to speak. Now, all these 36 transactions that I have on your screen up here have an aggregate deal flow of around $2.5 billion. So these transactions break up into transactions that are large-scale municipal water infrastructure, but also smaller scale safe water point, last mile delivery sort of water projects as well. Next slide, please. Now, if you break down the 36 projects that we see, or the 36 transactions that we see rather, they break down into what follows. A majority of them are in the water services space, followed by bulk water, storage and conveyance, infrastructure, and so on. As you can imagine, for utility scale infrastructure or for storage and conveyance or water services, there is a higher propensity to have business models that align themselves well to something like this. It's much harder to build business models or to build projects or to finance projects that are irrigation focus or flood prevention focus or climate change adaptation focus, because it's very hard to build business models that really pay back investors over time. And ultimately, if you are talking about blended finance transactions, by definition, you have a private party involved, and therefore, by definition, those private parties are return seeking, and hence you need to pay them back. So that's how the 36 transactions shake out when we break them down into subsector. Next slide, please. When we break them down into specific blended finance archetypes, so the first one being a direct investment within a capital structure, the second one being a guarantee, I think Peter alluded to that earlier, the third one being a grant that is used to design or prepare a project right at the outset for feasibility or for proof of concept, and then technical assistance. A majority of transactions that we see in the water space that are blended or that have been blended to date have involved transactions where donors or foundations have actually put money within the capital structure of a particular financing mechanism or transactions to do what? To alter the risk return for the private investors within that transaction, such that that transaction is now more worthwhile to them. And I'll walk you through an example a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So when we break this up by investors, we see there's a range of different investors. A majority of them, a plurality of them tend to be from development agencies and also from foundations. And that really is the idea of using foundational money or developmental money to really change that risk return or to reduce the perception between the reality of risk and actually the perception of risk, such that these projects can now get complete. If you look at investment instruments, the way it shakes out is a majority of this is done on a debt basis, then a grant basis, followed by equity and guarantees. I'd love to see more guarantees over time, but at the moment, we're seeing a majority of this being done on a debt basis. Next slide, please. Let me walk you through an example. I hope you can see this example on your screens clearly. This is an example that we funded through our design funding program. I'll talk to you about that in the next slide, but don't get scared by this graphic. It looks a little bit scary, but if we can follow through, I think it would make some sense. The idea for this particular project is essentially structuring a bond that will finance debt conversions for small island developing states that face climate issues. So really targeting SDG 14, life below water. Now, what are debt conversions? So debt conversions essentially provide funding support to governments in exchange for the commitment to improve policies and invest in marine conservation or climate adaptation activities. So how does this all work? If you look at number 1 and number 2 on your screen, essentially what's going to happen is a principal will stand up a not-for-profit trust that will raise both debt or equity. So this newly non-profit trust will be created. This will raise both debt and equity. This trust will then go and purchase a portion of that country's debt. So in this case, it was Seychelles. It will purchase a portion of that country's debt from official creditors, or what's known as the Paris Club of creditors that actually own some of this country's debt. And they'll purchase this debt at a discount, which will allow the country then to repay that trust on more manageable terms. Now, once the country repays this trust on more manageable terms, the trust in turn will go back and pay the initial investors, who are private investors perhaps, so they'll get some of their principal back and then some sort of a coupon on their principal. And then also they'll pay back some of the grant investors there as well if it's a returnable grant. And then they will use some of the remaining capital that they hold, because remember the debt was purchased on a discount, to fund a range of critical conservation activities, such as the creation of marine protection areas in this case, or even coral reef restoration. So what we have over here is we have investors participating in a transaction that wouldn't have participated otherwise. And essentially what you have is a range of different actors coming together in a win-win solution, whereby Seychelles has some debt relief, or they're paying back their debt on manageable terms. You've got conservation activities that are taking place that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And essentially you have investors that are fronting or providing basically some working capital for this trust to front some of this debt. So that's essentially how this particular transaction works and transactions comes together. This transaction has been successful and is now being trialed in other small island developing countries. Real quick, this particular project was supported through our design funding window. We have 3 windows at Convergence that are essentially used to design interesting transactions that we think have the potential to scale and we think are innovative. 2 of them specifically focused on Asia, one with the support and blessing of the Australian government, that's really focused on resilient infrastructure solutions in the Indo-Pacific. So this could be even wash-related infrastructure. And we also have another window that's supported by a Hong Kong-based family foundation that's really targeting natural capital solutions in the Asia-Pacific. So if you have, or your organization has interesting ideas in these 2 particular areas targeting Asia, we would love to hear from you. We'd love to work with you to submit a transaction. So please stay in touch and please check out some of the work that we're doing. And thank you very much to Oksana and her team for giving us the stage and for your time. Thank you very much indeed, and good night from here in Toronto.